Hello, I'm Merrick Masters. Welcome to Nixon's the One, the 1968 campaign. Today's episode refers to the Martin Luther King assassination and its political aftermath. I'm a professor of business emeritus, commentator, and podcaster. You can reach me at my email address and find me on my YouTube channel. To set the assassination of Martin Luther King in context, it's important to recall a strike and protest action that began among sanitation workers, primarily African American workers, located in Memphis, Tennessee. The protests and the strike began in March of 1968, and Martin Luther King had joined the protesters and marched with them in that month. He decided, upon request, to visit the protesters again in early April. On April the 3rd, the day before his assassination, King gave a speech to the protesters who were assembled. Originally, Ralph Abernathy was sent to speak on Dr. King's behalf, but he called Martin Luther King and said that he should come and speak because the audience really wanted to hear from him, which Martin Luther King did. And he delivered his now famous mountaintop speech, which has made an indelible mark on the American civil rights and political consciousness. That evening of April the 4th, a little bit after 6 o'clock, Dr. King was on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel where he was staying with several guests who were staying with him, including Ralph Abernathy and Jesse Jackson. And at 6:04 p.m. Central Time that evening, a bullet struck him and killed him. He was pronounced dead at the hospital, St. Joseph Hospital in Memphis, about an hour later. When reports of this hit the news media, it shocked the nation. And Robert Kennedy was campaigning in Indiana at that time and was scheduled to give a speech in a community of African Americans, primarily, on that evening, and decided to go ahead and give that presentation, even though he knew that King had been assassinated. And he met with the audience who was assembled there, and they did not know at that time that King had been assassinated. And he gave a well-known address in which he appealed to their peaceful side and talked about the assassination of his brother and his sentiments about that, and also his affection for Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was buried on April the 9th, 1968 in Atlanta, Georgia. The funeral was attended by many prominent Americans, including Richard Nixon, Vice President Humphrey, Senator Eugene McCarthy, Robert Kennedy, Jacqueline Onassis, and a host of other leaders in the civil rights and political communities. Richard Nixon attended that funeral and walked for a short period of time in the procession afterwards, which was going to Morehead University, where King went to school, and they were having a second dedication in his honor at that time. And Dwight Chapin, who was Nixon's personal aide, is speaking here about Nixon's trip. Nixon had also visited with Mrs. King the night before at her home in Atlanta, Georgia. There were numerous disruptions, civil orders after the assassination in 100 plus cities. There were 43 deaths reported in these disruptions, more than 3,000 injuries and 20,000 arrests. The National Guard and federal troops were called out in several localities, including Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. Spiro Agnew, who was then governor of Maryland, was one of the unintended beneficiaries of this civil disobedience. Shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King on April the 11th, he called a group of civil rights leaders to his office in Baltimore, Maryland, in which he essentially read them the so-called Riot Act and said that he was very disappointed in their unwillingness to speak up against the violence which had struck the city of Baltimore and other cities across the United States. And Agnew said, among other things, that it is deplorable and a sign of sickness in our society that the lunatic fringes of the Black and white communities speak with wide publicity while we, the moderates, remain continuously mute. I cannot believe he went on to say that the only alternative to white racism is Black racism. This speech got the attention of Richard Nixon, who only knew Agnew slightly at that point in time, but this really elevated his stature in Nixon's mind, and I think was a important development that led to Nixon's consideration of Agnew to be his vice presidential nominee in 1968. Another beneficiary of the civil disobedience was then candidate George Wallace, who was running on the third-party ticket as the American Independent Party candidates. He had been the governor of Alabama, and his wife had been elected to succeed him, although she passed away later in 1968 due to cancer. But Wallace continued his campaign. He was able to get on the ballot in all 50 states. And at one point in time in the campaign, sometime in August and September, he was polling close to 20% in the polls, and some thought that he might garner sufficient support in enough states to prevent either candidate or the major candidates, Hubert Humphrey or Richard Nixon at the time, from winning enough electoral votes to secure the presidency. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Stay tuned for more. I'm working on a book on Nixon's comeback in 1968, covering the period from 1962 to 1968. I think you'll find this a very interesting set of developments associated with this comeback. And 1968 was such a pivotal year, and the 60s were such a critical time period in American history that it's really a fascinating period and set of individuals, including Nixon, to examine in more detail from a historical perspective. Thank you, and have a good day.